I kept my eyes on the road and my mouth shut. That's something my wife Linda used to say about me. Martin Hale, she'd tell me, you see everything and say nothing. She meant it as a complaint mostly. 38 years of marriage, and she never quite figured out whether my silence was wisdom or stubbornness. Honestly, friends, neither did I. After she passed 3 years ago this coming October, I rattled around our house in Dayton for about 6 months before I lost my mind entirely. My son called it grief. My doctor called it depression. I called it what it actually was: too much time and not enough purpose. I'd spent 32 years as a structural engineer. I knew how things were supposed to hold together. I did not know how to sit still, so I went back to work. Not engineering, I was 61 and had no interest in re-entering that world. A buddy of mine named Dale had been driving for a car service, one of those corporate accounts where companies book regular rides for their executives. Clean cars, set schedules, decent pay. Dale said it kept his mind sharp and his calendar full. I called the company the following Monday. I want to be clear about something, because I know what some of you are thinking. I didn't need the money. Linda and I had planned carefully. The house was paid off, the retirement accounts were solid, and both our kids, my son Daniel and my daughter Claire, were grown and doing fine. I drove because I needed somewhere to be at 7 in the morning. I needed a reason to put on a clean shirt. I started in February. By March, I had a handful of regular clients who requested me specifically. I was punctual. I kept the car clean. I didn't talk unless they talked to me first. And I never asked questions about the calls they took in the back seat. In that line of work, friends, invisibility is the whole job. That's how I came to know, without him ever knowing me, the man my daughter was planning to marry. His name was Griffin Cole. Claire had been with him for almost 2 years when she brought him home for Thanksgiving. He was 34, worked in corporate acquisitions for a firm based downtown, dressed well, spoke confidently, and spent most of that first dinner asking me questions about my career with the kind of practiced interest that I recognized immediately as performance. He wasn't curious about me. He was auditioning for the role of future son-in-law. I smiled and answered and kept my observations to myself. Claire was 31 and happy in a way I hadn't seen her in years. She'd had a difficult stretch in her late 20s, a broken engagement to someone else, a job that burned her out, a period where she called me on Sunday evenings, and I could hear the exhaustion underneath every word. Griffin came along when she was rebuilding, and I think some part of her attached the two things together in her mind: him arriving and things getting better. I understood that. I didn't trust it, but I wasn't her keeper. She was an adult woman. I kept my eyes on the road and my mouth shut. I picked up Griffin Cole for the first time on a Tuesday in early April. The name on the booking was G. Cole, downtown pickup. Destination, the Meridian Tower on 5th. I pulled up to the address, a high-rise condo building with a glass lobby, and a man in a charcoal overcoat came through the doors without looking up from his phone. He got in the back seat, gave me a destination I already had, and said nothing else. I recognized him immediately. He did not look at me once. I want to tell you what went through my mind in those first 30 seconds, because it wasn't what you might expect. It wasn't excitement or anger or some sense of destiny. It was something quieter. It was the particular stillness that comes when you already suspected something and then the evidence simply arrives. I adjusted my mirror. I pulled into traffic. I said good morning, and he made a sound that wasn't quite a response. He was on the phone before we reached the first light. Not a conversation, emails, from the sound of it, dictating responses to his assistant. His voice was efficient and clipped. He had the habit of people who are accustomed to being listened to without having to make an effort to be interesting. I drove him to Meridian Tower. He got out without acknowledgement. The following Monday, he booked me again, and the Monday after that. By the 3rd week of April, Griffin Cole and I had a standing arrangement that he had initiated and I had not discouraged. He was a creature of routine. Same pickup time, same destination, same backseat position. He always sat behind the passenger seat, never behind the driver. I noted that. He took calls every morning, corporate calls, mostly acquisition targets, due diligence timelines, conference room bookings. The language of his work was precise and bloodless. He was good at it, I'll give him that. Whatever else I came to think of Griffin Cole, the man was competent at his job. The first thing that unsettled me wasn't anything he said about Claire. It was the way he spoke to people he considered beneath him. His assistant, a young woman named Priya, called him one morning to say she'd rescheduled a lunch. He responded in a tone so flat and dismissive that I felt it in my chest. Not yelling, nothing so overt. Just the particular coldness of someone who has decided that another person's inconvenience is not worth their full attention. I watched him in my mirror. His expression never changed. He was already reading the next email before she finished speaking. I thought about Claire. She was a physical therapist. She ran her own small practice now, something she'd built from nothing over 4 years. She talked about her patients the way I used to talk about load-bearing calculations with real focus, real investment. She cared about the work. I wondered whether Griffin Cole had ever asked her about it in the tone he used when he spoke to Priya. I kept driving. I said nothing. In the second week of May, Griffin took a call I was not meant to hear in the way that I heard it. He'd been quiet that morning, scrolling through something on his phone with a slight tension in his jaw that I'd come to recognize as pre-call concentration. Then his phone buzzed, and he answered without his usual efficiency. His voice shifted looser, more familiar. The person on the other end was someone named Todd, who I gathered was a longtime friend and possibly a college roommate based on the references they made. "Everything's moving," Griffin said. "Timeline's basically set." Todd said something I couldn't catch. "Yeah, Charlotte." A pause. "End of the year, ideally, before the wedding makes sense. Get settled first, then she can transfer her practice, or..." He stopped, a small sound, like a laugh that didn't quite form. "I mean, realistically, Todd, the practice doesn't make sense to transfer. She'd basically be starting over. It's probably just easier if she doesn't." I kept my hands at 10 and 2. I want to tell you, friends, that I reacted with calm and clarity. I want to tell you I processed that sentence the way a reasonable man processes information methodically, without conclusion jumping. That would be a lie. What I actually did was grip the wheel and count to 8 and breathe through my nose the way Linda taught me when I got angry, which was the same thing she taught our kids, which was the same thing her mother had taught her, which I suppose is one of the ways people you love stay with you after they're gone. Claire had built that practice over 4 years. She had told me about every patient she couldn't help, every insurance battle she'd fought, every piece of equipment she'd saved to buy. She talked about it the way I talked about the Chambers Street Bridge project in 1997 as the thing I was most proud of making with my own hands. Griffin Cole had just described it, to his friend Todd, as probably easier if she doesn't. He hadn't mentioned this move to Charlotte to Claire. I knew this because Claire and I had dinner every other Sunday. She told me everything, always had, since she was about 14 and decided I was safe to talk to. She had not mentioned Charlotte. She had not mentioned any plan to relocate. The last conversation we'd had about her future, she told me she was looking at expanding her patient intake in the spring. I drove Griffin Cole to Meridian Tower. He got out without acknowledgement. I sat in the parking structure for 11 minutes before I felt ready to drive again. Now, I know what you're thinking, friends, and I thought it too, immediately. Why didn't I just tell her? I want to explain something about my daughter, because it matters. Claire is the most loyal person I have ever known. It is her greatest strength and the thing that most terrifies me about her. When she loves someone, she builds a case for them, in her mind, a complete, thorough case. The way a good lawyer builds a case, with evidence and context, and the most charitable interpretation of every available fact. And once that case is built, new information doesn't simply update it. New information has to overcome it. It has to fight through every argument she's already made on that person's behalf. I had watched her do this with the man before Griffin. I had watched her do it with a job that was slowly hollowing her out. I had said the wrong thing at the wrong moment on both occasions, and spent 6 months on the wrong side of a closed door because of it. I knew my daughter. I knew that if I called her that evening and said, "Griffin is planning to move you to Charlotte without telling you," the first question she would ask is how I knew. And when I told her, the conversation would stop being about Griffin's plans and start being about why her father was driving strangers around and not telling her, and whether I'd been checking up on her, and whether I thought she couldn't make her own decisions. I'm not saying she'd be wrong to ask those things. I'm saying that's what would happen. And at the end of that conversation, Griffin would still be there, and I would not be. So I drove him again the following Monday, and I listened. By the middle of June, I had accumulated the following. Griffin's firm had offered him a position in their Charlotte office, a significant promotion he had already verbally accepted. He had toured 2 properties in the Myers Park neighborhood with a real estate agent, the second of which he had described to Todd as the one. He had consulted with a financial advisor about restructuring his assets before the wedding. A conversation I caught the tail end of that included the phrase, "protect the upside." He had spoken to his mother about the move. He had not spoken to Claire. I want to be precise about that last part. In 7 weeks of morning drives, Griffin Cole mentioned Claire's name in 4 separate phone calls, once to reference her family connections in a conversation about the wedding guest list, once to say she was on board with the general direction of their life plan, which I can only describe as a sentence that a person says when they have not actually had the conversation, but intend to frame the absence of objection as consent, once to confirm to his mother that Claire was flexible, and once the one that stayed with me when Todd asked how Claire felt about the move, and Griffin said, "She'll be fine. She adjusts. She adjusts." I thought about the woman who had rebuilt herself from nothing at 28, who had sat in my kitchen at midnight when her first practice location fell through, and worked out a new plan on a legal pad rather than cry about the old one, who had called me from the hospital parking lot after a difficult patient outcome, not for comfort exactly, but because she needed to say out loud what she was carrying before she could carry it further. She adjusts. I drove. I said nothing. I planned. What I was waiting for, friends, was the right moment, not a moment I created. A moment that arrived on its own, one that Griffin Cole walked himself into without any assistance from me, because that was the only kind of moment that would work, the only kind Claire would believe. It arrived in July. Griffin and Claire had planned an engagement dinner. Immediate family, close friends, about 20 people, at a restaurant downtown that Claire had chosen. She called me the week before, excited in a way that made my chest hurt a little, because I recognized the excitement and I knew what was underneath it. She asked me to say something. A toast. I said I would. I thought about that toast for 7 days. The dinner was on a Saturday. I arrived early, the way I always do, and found a seat near the end of the long table. Griffin's parents were there, his father, a retired banker named Gerald, and his mother, Carol, who was pleasant in the determined way of women who have decided to be pleasant regardless of circumstances. Claire's friends surrounded her at the center of the table, and I watched her laugh at something one of them said and thought, she doesn't know. She is sitting in the middle of a life she thinks she's building, and she doesn't know the foundation is already different from what she believes. Dinner proceeded. The food was good. Toasts were made. Griffin's college friend gave one that mentioned Charlotte. He caught himself mid-sentence. A subtle stumble. A quick glance at Griffin, and smoothly redirected to something about the future. I noticed. I filed it. When it was my turn, I stood up. I want to be honest with you about what I said, because some of you will think it was too much, and some of you will think it was not enough, and I've made peace with both reactions. I said that Claire was the person who taught me the most about patience. I said that she had the particular courage of someone who builds things slowly and carefully, who doesn't take shortcuts, who always reads the full contract before she signs. I said that I had always trusted her judgment, and that her judgment had always trusted facts. Then I said I wanted to ask the happy couple a question, because I was an engineer and we can't help ourselves. I said I'd heard something wonderful, that they had exciting plans taking shape. New city, new chapter. I looked at Griffin when I said it. I smiled the way I smile when I know more than I'm letting on, which Linda used to say was my most unsettling expression. I said, Griffin, when did you tell Claire about Charlotte? The table went quiet in the particular way that tables go quiet when something real has entered the room. Griffin's expression moved through several states in about 2 seconds. Surprise, calculation, a fast assembling of response options. He was good under pressure, I'll grant him that. He smiled and said something about plans still being in discussion, very early stages, nothing confirmed. I nodded. I looked at Claire. She was not looking at Griffin's smile. She was looking at Griffin's eyes. And because she was my daughter, because she had spent 31 years learning to read what people meant rather than what they said, I watched her understand something in real time. Not just that he hadn't told her on purpose. That very early stages was not true. That the verbal acceptance, the property tours, the financial restructuring, the conversation with his mother, none of that was early stages. None of that was in discussion. She was quiet for a moment that lasted a long time. Then she said very calmly, Griffin, Have you already accepted the position in Charlotte? The table waited. He said, we were going to talk about it. Claire nodded slowly. She picked up her water glass and took a sip. She set it down with the precise, deliberate movement of someone who is very carefully deciding what to do next. When? She said. He said her name. He reached for her hand across the table. She moved her hand back, not dramatically, just back. I'd like to know, she said, how long the conversation we were going to have has been scheduled without my knowledge. Her voice was completely even. It was the most frightening thing I had ever heard her say, because Claire's anger is not loud. Her anger is precise. Griffin looked at me once. It was the first time he had actually looked at me since April. I met his eyes and held them and didn't say a word. The engagement dinner ended about 40 minutes later. It didn't shatter. Claire is too composed for that, and the guests were kind enough to take their cues from her. But the energy had changed irrevocably, the way a room changes after you've said the true thing that everyone was pretending not to know. Claire called me the next morning at 8 o'clock. She said, "How did you know about Charlotte?" I told her the truth, all of it. The booking system, the April morning, the 7 weeks of drives, the property in Myers Park, the conversation with Todd, the phrase, "she'll be fine, she adjusts," all of it. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "You drove him for 7 weeks and he never recognized you." I said, "He never looked." Another long silence. "Dad," she said. And then she didn't say anything else for a moment, and I just held the phone and waited, because that's what she needed. Finally, she said, "He told his mother before he told me." "Yes," I said. "And the practice. He was just going to." "Yes." She made a sound that wasn't quite crying and wasn't quite not. "Why didn't you just tell me?" And this is what I told her, friends. I told her what I had spent 7 weeks understanding. I said, "Because you would have fought for him. Not because you were wrong or naive, because that's who you are. And you deserve to see it yourself, not take my word for it." She was quiet again. Then she said, "I hate that you're right." And I said, "I know. I got that from your mother." She laughed. It was a small and broken laugh, but it was real. Claire and Griffin did not get married. She ended the engagement formally 2 weeks after the dinner, after a series of conversations I was not part of and did not ask about. She told me later that what broke it wasn't the Charlotte plan itself. She might have considered Charlotte, she said, if he had ever actually asked. What broke it was that he hadn't asked. That in his mind, her life was a variable he was already adjusting around his fixed points. She adjust, he told Todd. She did adjust, just not in the direction he expected. I still drive, different clients now. I rotated my schedule after everything settled, no particular reason except that it felt like the right time for a change. I still put on a clean shirt in the morning. I still need somewhere to be at 7 o'clock. What I understand now, that I didn't quite have the words for in February when I first started driving strangers through Dayton, is that invisible isn't a bad thing to be. Linda was right that I see everything and say nothing. But there are moments when what you've seen becomes the only tool that matters, and the not saying becomes a choice instead of a habit. Griffin Cole sat in my car for 7 weeks. He took his calls. He made his plans. He never once wondered who was behind the wheel. He saw a driver. He didn't see a father. That was his mistake, and I never had to say a single word about it. Sometimes the most powerful thing a parent can do is nothing and trust that the truth will arrive on its own. Martin didn't rescue his daughter. He simply stayed close, stayed quiet, and gave her the space to see clearly for herself. The people who love us most aren't always the ones who speak the loudest. Sometimes they're just the ones who never look away. A small note for you: this story was created and fictionalized by AI, crafted to bring you a moment of entertainment while leaving behind something real. The quiet reminder that love, patience, and trust in the people we cherish are always worth holding on to.